All right, thanks for tuning in this week. I'm joined by Wes McAdams, who is a minister and somebody who has his own podcast. How are you doing today, Wes?
I'm good, brother. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So I just told you this, but I've listened to your podcast a couple times and read your blog and website. And growing up in Wisconsin and not being as, I guess, surrounded by a lot of churches of Christ, I'm always amazed by how God uses people in the Church of Christ and how we've connected over the years. And one of the things when I started listening to your podcast was you talked about creating conversations, and you also mentioned coffee. So that made me happy as well. Two things
Absolutely.
that I try to do is create conversations for people that maybe disagree, and enjoy a cup of coffee is something I love. So your podcast is based on that concept. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that we have a responsibility as Christians to create and model. Maybe that's the best word, to model civil conversations. We have a responsibility to model what civility, what kind, generous, gentle, self-controlled conversations look like. We should not only model the fruit of the Spirit in our life and the things that we do, but also in the way that we talk. And I think that the internet, especially social media, has created an atmosphere where people are very defensive, and we don't model civil conversation. That's not just Christians. Lots of people don't model civil conversation, don't model just good, gentle, kind, generous conversation. And I think the church has a responsibility not only to engage in conversations about various issues and ideas and worldviews, but also to do it in a way that's kind, a way that's modeling the fruit of the Spirit. So that was the basic idea, is that I wanted to model those kind of conversations by having those kind of conversations, and then encourage people not just to engage with me or the guests that I have on my podcast, but to have those kind of conversations. That's what I say in my intro every week, is that I want to encourage people to have conversations like this with the people in their life. And so that's the idea, is that we can grow a lot as individuals, and we can help other people grow if we engage in conversation in the right way, in a way that is filled with the Spirit.
Absolutely. And I was thinking about, there's texts in the Bible where, Paul disagrees with Peter, and it says that he confronts him to his face.
Yeah.
I've always, and even Paul had issues with other people on his journeys where they'd part ways. One person goes another place, and Paul goes on his way with somebody else. And so we even have, like, in the New Testament, people disagreeing as they're spreading Christianity and spreading the message of Jesus. And you look at Jesus kind of confronting people. So I guess one of the things, creating conversations is important. How does, confrontation, where does that factor in? Do you have any ideas about that?
I think sometimes we have this tendency to engage in disagreement all at the same volume and all at the same level, not recognizing that that disagreement and conflict, confrontation, admonishment, all of those things require discernment and wisdom to know at what level should I disagree with this person? At what volume should I disagree with this person? When Jesus confronted people and did so harshly, and we might even use the word harsh, right, that he did that with people that were religious leaders, people that were supposed to be teachers, people that were leading people astray, people that were wolves in sheep's clothing, so to speak. And so those are the people that he was harsh with. Those were the people that the volume was turned up, so to speak. And Paul the same way. And the matters on which he was disagreeing with someone. So when Paul was the harshest, for instance, Galatians is an incredibly harsh book. but it was because the false teachers that he was dealing with, and it's within that book that he mentions his conflict with Peter and how he admonished him to his face. And when he's dealing with those issues, he's dealing with essentially what we would call racism, culturalism, maybe even. You've got Jewish Christians who believe that they are the only ones that have a corner on a covenant relationship with God. And Peter is playing into that. Peter is disassociating himself with Gentile believers. And Paul says, you're walking in a way that's not in step with the gospel. And so for an apostle of Jesus to be living a hypocritical, what Paul calls hypocritical life, a life that's not in step with the gospel, well, that's a big issue. That's not a little thing. And so it's not a matter of is tea or coffee better. You know, I mean, there's things that we can disagree about, and we can do so in a way that's, you know, we're not taking a hard dogmatic stance. And there's a lot even within Scripture that, okay, well, I see where you're coming from, and oh, I see where you're coming from, and oh, that's a different point of view, and I've never heard that perspective. And there's all kinds of different areas that we could disagree on. And then there's what is essentially heresy, what is not in step with the gospel. And that might call for a little bit more dogmatic of a stance. But then at the same time, I think we also have to recognize that I'm not Jesus and I'm not even an apostle, you know? And so where Jesus may have been able to see it, not may have been, but he was able to see into the hearts and minds of people, I'm not able to do that. And where Paul had direct revelation from Jesus to know what to say and what not to say, and how to handle a situation, and what was true and versus some of these other things, you know, that's a little bit different than our situation. So we have to approach it with a little more humility, a little more gentleness than maybe they did, and always love. You know, so Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. You know, describes what love looks like. Love isn't arbitrary. It's not ambiguous to what does love mean? It means being patient and kind and gentle and self-control. I mean, that's what love looks like. And so we have to engage with people in love, even if we disagree. And the level at which we disagree and how dogmatic we are, it really depends on the conversation and the issue that we're discussing.
Yeah, and I think you bring up, I mean, several good points. One of them that I was thinking about is just Jesus had harsher words for the religious leaders. And when I think about you being a minister and me, you know, being a minister at my work, that's very convicting to me. I think that, you know, Paul was really harsh with Peter at times, and vice versa. Jesus was very harsh with Peter. I think that's because there was a level of, okay, these guys have leadership in the future, and he knows that, and he sees them as leaders. So that's very convicting to me. And I'm just wondering, when did you start your podcast?
When I was working in Abilene, I don't remember how many years ago it was. We're on the 4th season now, and each season has about 20, 25 different episodes.
Okay.
So, but when I was in Abilene, and the way it really started was, it didn't really start with conversations that disagree, and probably most of the conversations on the podcast are not disagreeable. They're not over issues on which we disagree, but they may touch on things with which other people may disagree, and right. There may be some points of disagreement as we go through an issue. But it really started with a couple friends of mine in Abilene, at the church I was working with there, and we were having these conversations anyway, kind of iron sharpening iron types of conversations, where we were talking about mostly the things I had been preaching about, or maybe Bible classes, or things we were studying, or things we were thinking about. And we were having these conversations that would go for an hour or whatever. Yeah. And we said, well, why don't we just record these? You know, we get other people not only in on the conversation because they may gain something from the conversation itself, but also to encourage people to have deep spiritual conversations and to not worry. I think sometimes we don't engage in those conversations because we're afraid we're going to disagree, or because we're afraid we don't know enough. And we say, well, I'm not a preacher, or I'm not a minister, or I'm not a deacon, or whatever, so I don't know enough to engage in those conversations. That's nonsense. We all, we grow by just jumping into it and talking about it, and even saying, I'm not sure about this. I don't know. I don't have an opinion, or I haven't studied that enough. And as we talk about these things, we grow, and it's a necessary discipline for spiritual growth to have spiritual conversations. And so often, even in the church, our conversations are limited to football or the weather, or what's going on with our family, and those things have their place. But if we're not having spiritual conversations about Scripture and about Jesus and about how we're doing in our walk with Jesus and all of these things, then we're missing out on a big part of what Jesus has in mind for the church, for a community that's founded on faith. And if we're not talking about our faith and having those faith conversations, then we're really missing out.
So have you felt like you've gotten growth since doing this, since kind of hitting the record button and putting yourself out there a little bit more? What has been the growth like for you as a leader and as a minister?
Yeah, I would say, I don't know that I could pinpoint the conversations on the podcast specifically as being an area of personal growth, but I would say it's a component of one of the areas of biggest growth. So I would say that my personal growth has come about through conversations, some of which have been recorded and some of which haven't been recorded.
Right.
But there's nothing like sitting down, like you said, for a cup of coffee and talking about life and faith with our friends, with our brothers, with our sisters. I've got an episode that's coming out soon with a man who is an atheist, and so he's not even a believer at all. He was, but he lost his faith, sadly. But it was even helpful to have a conversation with him. But that's a conversation that I've been having with this particular gentleman for 2 years now. And so we've been talking for a couple of years, and it's helped me to process how does an atheist feel about the way we talk about atheists? How does he feel about the way we talk about faith and lack of faith? And so that conversation for 2 years has been incredibly beneficial and helpful for me. And yeah, the 30-minute conversation we had with the record button going was great as well, and helpful. But that's just the podcast part of it is just a small sampling of the conversations that I get to have every day of the week. And there's tremendous blessing and growth in having those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had, I guess, people close to me that will listen to my show and just be like, I want to have conversations with you like that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've ever faced this, but it's like, I have these great conversations recording stuff. I don't know if I'm like mentally prepared, like I'm going to do this. And then I get out of the recording studio, which I don't have, but anyways, I get out of the space of recording, and then I go to just a normal space, and it's like I'm not turning it on as much. So I feel like it's almost motivated me to be a better listener and to realize how unfocused I am sometimes with like people I really need to be focused with. So that's been, I don't know, have you ever felt anything like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great example and a great way to put it. And I think that that's true in a lot of areas in our life. When we sort of force ourselves, or we have an atmosphere or a schedule that forces us to do something that we ought to do anyway, it's beneficial. But it's especially beneficial if we find ways to work that into our daily life. So, I mean, it's the same thing with Bible study or listening to a sermon or singing praises or prayer. Coming to worship, coming to the assembly, it sort of forces us to do those things that we really ought to have integrated into our daily life, but sometimes we don't, because we don't have that reminder, or even, you might even say, peer pressure. When you're in the assembly, you sort of have this, community type of an environment that forces you to engage in those spiritual disciplines. when you're in your everyday life, maybe not so much. And so it's the same, I think, with the podcast. We've sort of built this into our schedule and into our life to have these conversations, and it forces us to do it, so to speak, although we're obviously not forced to do it.
Right.
But it's maybe harder to integrate that into our everyday life. For me, it started the other direction in that I was having these conversations anyway, and that was sort of the norm. But maybe I think particularly where I was in Abilene, for the first time in my life, I had people in my life that engaged me on that level. For so many times as a preacher, it's so funny. I'll get done preaching a sermon, and I always use as an example, if I tell a story about a rabbit and I say, hey, when I was a kid, I had a pet rabbit, and then I go on and I preach this sermon for 30 minutes, and then I get done. The only thing people want to talk about is the rabbit. Hey, I had a rabbit, or I saw a rabbit the other day. And it's like, well, I don't really want to talk about the rabbit. I'd rather talk about the Spirit of God, or I'd rather talk about Jesus, or I'd rather talk about these things. But you want to engage me about the rabbit. And I think that that's because people are just so in a habit of keeping the conversation at a superficial level. And it's very difficult to make yourself vulnerable, to open yourself up and reveal what you know or what you don't know, or what your insecurities are, or whatever that may be. And I've been blessed to have people in my life who are willing and enjoy having those deeper conversations, who force me on one hand, but also are willing to engage with me. So when I get done preaching a sermon and they come up and say, hey, I want to ask you about this that you said, and why did you say this? And that really made me think about this. And I thought about this other passage. And then we really dig in and we get into this great conversation. And that's sort of the evolution of what became the podcast, was people that were willing to engage the preacher about those types of spiritual issues. And so it's really helpful to be that kind of a person that engages people about those types of spiritual issues, and also to have people in our life, to find people and be drawn to people that are willing to have those deeper conversations. So I think either way we can do it. We can be the person who is the impetus, who starts the conversation, who's the catalyst for that conversation, or we can bring people into our life that seem to be the type of people that are willing and excited and enjoy having those types of conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there certain things, like maybe if you had like, hey, here's 3 things we need to be talking about more in the church? Do you have a list? I don't know if I do. I'm trying to ask myself too.
Yeah, I don't, for me, it's not a list. For me, it's just the things that come up, as we're studying, as we're doing our personal study, or maybe we're all listening to the same sermons, or we're listening to the same Bible studies, or maybe it's, hey, grab a book and you're reading the same book that your friend is reading, and then you talk about those things together. It may be a million different things. It may be a song, it may be whatever. And so it's really just where it really is so personal. And I think that that's the thing that's hard about these types of conversations, is that they are very personal. It's, where are you? What's going on in your life? What are you thinking about? What are you processing? And so, it's just having the audacity to bring up those things, and making yourself vulnerable and saying, I'm really struggling. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a sin. Sometimes we talk about being vulnerable as revealing our sins and our struggles, and that's definitely part of it. But it's also just struggling to understand something. And I was really blessed to grow up in a home where these are the kinds of things that we talk about. My wife laughs at me all the time because I'll get off the phone with my mom and she'll say, well, how's your mom? And I say, I don't have any idea. And she said, what do you mean you don't have any idea? I was like, well, we didn't talk about how she was. We didn't talk about the weather. We didn't talk about what's going on. We talked about, whatever this passage says. We're talking about Romans 8. I don't know. I don't know how she's doing, because we were talking about Romans 8. So that's just what we did in our house growing up, in our family. We would sing hymns while we were driving down the highway. We would talk about scripture, and we still do. And so when we have a conversation, it's usually about church, or it's about scripture, or it's about something we're struggling to understand. And so That's part of my DNA because that's the
Mhm.
family I grew up in. But I want it to be part of my kids' DNA, that's just normal, that it's normal to have conversations about spiritual things, that you don't have to be
Mhm.
quote unquote at church to have these types of conversations. So yeah, I think that whatever the topic or the issue or the thing to be discussed is, it really depends on the person and what's going on in their life and where they are in their walk and what they're trying to understand at the moment.
Yeah, because I like that because, just kind of reviewing some of your episodes that you've done, like it's been about talking about movies with somebody. I know you reviewed, it's been a little bit now, but the new Paul movie,
Mm.
it might be like over a year old now. But anyways, talking about movies with somebody to talking about technology to talking about parenting. And, you do have a wide range of topics on your website, and I think that's good because you're trying to meet people where they're at, I guess is
Right.
kind of what you're saying. So if people want
Yeah.
to talk about scripture, if people want to talk about social media and how people use it, I feel like those are something that has come up a lot, is just, and we talked about this, I guess, at the very beginning to reference it, like how Christians engage in social media. I think that's something that I feel convicted. I don't feel like uh, to to use what we're talking about. I don't feel like an expert on like, okay, this is how you should use it. But I do probably see things on social media that I'm like, why is this person, posting this, and why are they replying to that? Um, what do you think is like a healthy sense of how Christians can engage on, Facebook and Instagram, all this stuff on the internet?
I think a good rule of thumb is to try your best to take the anonymity out of it,
Okay.
to not feel like you're engaging with an anonymous person, but that you're engaging with somebody who's real. This is a real person. This isn't a two-dimensional avatar. This is a real life person. They have struggles. They have friends. They have family. They have children. They've got a spouse. They've got parents. They are a real person. One of the things that I keep in my mind a lot is that I've known some people that have had some pretty severe learning disabilities, people that if you met them in person, you'd have a whole lot of understanding about sort of where they are intellectually. And you would say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to take what this person says with a grain of salt because, obviously, they're not, they're a person that has some learning disabilities.
Mhm.
And so that when you engage with them in real life, in person. But then I've seen them on social media and you wouldn't be able to tell by what they write. It sounds very coherent, although it's very belligerent or it's very dogmatic. And then people engage with them as if they're dealing with someone who doesn't have those learning disabilities. And I think, oh, whoa, slow down. If you knew this person in real life, you would take what they said with a grain of salt. There's no way in the world you would engage with them like that. And I try
Mhm.
to remember that you just don't know who you're dealing with. We assume, we read one paragraph of something someone wrote, or maybe even a sentence somebody wrote, and we
Right.
assume we know who they are. We know, oh, I know this kind of person. This is a troll. This is a whatever. This is a whatever. Well, but regardless, they are a real life person that you not only have an obligation to deal with them in love, but you also have an obligation to set a good example, because there are people watching. For everybody who likes and loves and laughs and leaves a little, emoticon on
Right.
your comment, or everybody that comments on it, there's at least 10 or 20 other people that read it and said nothing, and you'd
Mhm.
never know they were there. They're sort of Facebook stalking, and they're
Right. Right.
reading these things, and they're hovering above it, and they're watching what we're saying, but also how we're saying it. And it's really hard to read the emotion that we're putting into it when you're on the outside. So we have to go above and beyond to say, hey, I really appreciate that comment. That's an interesting perspective. I've never thought about it that way, but I disagree for these reasons. It's not wrong to disagree with someone on social media, but if we're doing it in such a way that says, I don't care about you, I don't like you, I don't care about your opinion, I don't care what you think, if we're doing it harsh and unloving, not only are we hurting that person with whom we're engaging, but we're also hurting the people that are watching and listening to what we're saying. And there's been multiple times online where I've had a conversation with somebody and I'm mad, because whatever they said, I'm frustrated at what they said.
Yeah.
But the rare times I've done well and engaged with them well, I've had some instances where they've private messaged me and apologized and said, you know what? It's amazing how when somebody is harsh and rude and we're loving in response to them, it shames them. And sometimes that shame causes them to push back even harder. Sometimes though, they engage, they realize their own guilt and they realize, wow,
Right.
I was really rude. I shouldn't have said it that way. And so always respond with kind. I mean, but this is basic gospel living, right? I mean, Romans 12, this is how we overcome evil. We overcome evil, not with more evil, but we overcome evil with good. And so we just, and when it's in writing, we have to be so very careful. I love the little smiley faces. Hey, there's a smiley face. Here's a winky face, just so the emotion that I'm putting behind this, or even just prefacing what you say and say, hey, I'm going to say some things, I'm going to disagree with you, but please read it in a tone of love and kindness because I care about you and I love you and I want us to be friends. And so whatever we have to do to sort of put an addendum on it or put a preface on it to say, hey, read this in the right tone because I'm really coming at this with a degree of love and care. And I think if we can engage that way, we set a better example and we become attractive and magnetic. People say, you know what? I don't know about those Christian people, what they believe, but man, I love how they engage with people online. And that's the furthest thing from what people are saying right now. So we've got to do a better job. We got to do a better job.
It is basic and simple, when you talk about, okay, we overcome evil with good, we treat people with kindness and patience, meet people where they're at, but yet it's so difficult. And I was even thinking like, okay, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells people, if you have a problem with somebody, go to them.
Yes.
If you think somebody has a problem with you, you go to them. You think about, we reference Galatians where Peter gets confronted by Paul and it says to his face, like they didn't, it wasn't through letters, they met each other and talked to each other and it is basic. It's been, Jesus said it, it's kind of love your neighbor as yourself, but I feel like we really need it. We really need that message. And I think my own, just talking about me, like my own self-worth can be, how many people liked this episode, how many people listened to my podcast. And then sometimes I'm like, man, if I was like a lot more controversial or a lot more rude, I'd probably get more responses. But that's like the total opposite of why I started it in the first place.
Right.
So it can get so, I guess, humbling and convicting, but it like brings me joy. It's like, well, there probably are a lot of people who scan by my page and I never know they were there because there's not any big things that I'm trying to do. But yet it is such a big thing to me to like plant seeds of having conversations with people and engaging with people. You talked about the reference of Peter and Paul, that was a big issue because it was, I would say it was, racism, dealing with the Jewish Gentile relationship. It wasn't racism based on skin color, but it was based off of culture and the way things were done. So that was a big, big deal. We need to think through, and it does take wisdom and discernment. Okay, what did make the early church so upset? And like you said, a lot of times it was Jesus being harsh on the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were supposed to be the leaders and people up front. So that, I don't know. It really, I guess, stirs a lot of things in me to just be talking about this issue with somebody with I think the same passion of like, okay, what are we doing? Will Christians ever be the people that people look at and are like, hey, I want to do things the way they do things? I don't know. Yeah. I'm trying, so we'll see.
And it does. It makes a difference, and we feel like it doesn't. We feel like it's easy to feel like the controversial things, the fighting and the arguing, that gets all of the attention.
Yeah.
And of course it does, and it stirs up people's passions, and so and that's the way the algorithms work, right? So on Facebook, if people are commenting and arguing and liking and leaving the angry face or whatever, then Facebook says, I'm going to put this in more people's news feeds so that more people get stirred up and more people get angry and fight about it. But we've got to remember, like you said, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? And if we can, through kindness and love and good conversations, even when they disagree, if we can help one person to move more towards Jesus, then we've done far more good than the fighting and arguing. If the fighting and arguing draws 1,000 people's attention to that conversation, but yet all of those people are only getting more entrenched in their opposite sides, they're becoming more polarized. It's not helping move people together. It's not bringing about reconciliation and peace. It's bringing about more conflict and more polarization. And so the 1,000 people that are becoming more polarized, that's the opposite. And it's less effective than the one person who's moved closer to Jesus and closer to the people in their life. And so it's not about how many people we engage, but about the transformation that's happening, that God is doing through us and through these conversations in the hearts and minds of people. And so it's better to engage and transform and help to move in the right direction one person than it is to entrench 1,000 people in the position they held in the first place.
I love that. I probably need to re-listen to that, because Me too. I need to hear that sometimes. I can get really caught up in, what am I doing? Is this making any difference? But I think of like planting seeds, and you never know what God's going to do with those seeds.
That's exactly right.
This is really good. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise, brother.
I love that I can, just engage with as much as technology drives me crazy, it's so fun to like, hey, we're going to talk to somebody from Texas now, and it's crystal clear sound and picture. And now, we can put it up for all 11 of my listeners. So,
well, those are 11 people that you're blessing, brother. So keep up the good work.
Where can we find you on social media?
Well, my blog is radicallychristian.com, and you can find it on Facebook or on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter, Wes McAdams. But just go to radicallychristian.com and you can find all the links there.
Awesome. One of the things that you do is you also have like a 2-minute answering questions in 2 minutes. That's kind of fun. So
that's something I did a while back. I've thought about, revamping that podcast.
Oh, okay.
But I haven't done that. I haven't touched that in years. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I saw that. I listened to a couple of them, and I was well, this is perfect. People like 2 minutes. So.
Yeah. Short attention spans for sure.
Cool. Thanks.
For sure. Well, thanks, brother.